The T-26 tank was a Soviet light infantry tank used during many conflicts of the 1930s and in World War II. It was a development of the British Vickers 6-ton tank and was one of the most successful tank designs of the 1930s until its light armour became vulnerable to newer anti-tank guns. It was produced in greater numbers than any other tank of the period, with more than 11,000 manufactured. During the 1930s, the USSR developed 53 variants of the T-26, including flame-throwing tanks, combat engineer vehicles, remotely controlled tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery tractors, and armoured carriers. 23 of these were series-produced, others were experimental models. The T-26 together with the BT was the main tank of the Red Army's armoured forces during the interwar period. The T-26 was the most important tank of the Spanish Civil War and played a significant role during the Battle of Lake Khasan in 1938 as well as in the Winter War in 1939 Euro 40. Though nearly obsolete by the beginning of World War II, the T-26 was the most numerous tank in the Red Army's armoured force during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The T-26 fought the Germans and their allies during the Battle of the Moscow in 1941 Euro 42, the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of the Caucasus in 1942 Euro 1943. Some tank units of the Leningrad Front used their T-26s until 1944. Soviet T-26 light tanks last saw use in August 1945, during the defeat of the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The T-26 was exported and used extensively by Spain, China and Turkey. Captured T-26s were used by the Finnish, German, Romanian and Hungarian armies. The tank was reliable and simple to maintain, and its design was continually modernized between 1931 and 1941. No new models of the T-26 were developed after 1940. British origin, the T-26 was a Soviet development of the British Vickers 6-ton tank, which was designed by the Vickers Armstrongs Company in 1928 Euro 29. The simple and easy-to-maintain Vickers 6-ton was intended for export to less technically advanced countries, the Soviet Union, Poland, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, Thailand, China, and many others. Vickers advertised the tank in military publications, and both the Soviet Union and Poland expressed interest in the Vickers design. In early 1930, the Soviet Buying Committee, under the direction of Simeon Geinzberg, arrived in Great Britain to select tanks, tractors, and cars for use in the Red Army. The Vickers 6-ton was among 4 models of tanks selected by Soviet representatives during their visit to Vickers Armstrongs. Under the contract signed on May 28, 1930, the company delivered to the USSR 15 twin-turreted Vickers Mk water-cooled Vickers machine guns, tanks together with full technical documentation to enable series production of the tank in the USSR. The ability of the 2 turrets of the Type A to turn independently made it possible to fire to both the left and right at once, which was considered advantageous for breakthroughs of field entrenchments. Several Soviet engineers participated in assembly of the tanks at the Vickers factory in 1930. The first 4 Vickers 6-ton tanks arrived in the USSR at the end of 1930. The last tanks arrived in 1932, when series production of the T-26 was already in progress. The British tanks were sent to Soviet factories for study in preparation for series production and to military educational institutions and training units. Later, some tanks were given to military supply depots and proving grounds. The Vickers-built 6-ton tanks had the designator V-26 in the USSR. 3 British tanks were successfully tested for cross-country ability at the small proving ground near Moscow on Poklonnaya Hill in January 1931. Klement Voroshilov ordered the creation of the Special Commission for the Red Army new tanks under the direction of S. Geinzberg to define the tank type suitable for the Red Army. The T-19 8-ton light infantry tank, developed by S. Geinzberg under the program at the Bolshevik plant in Leningrad, was a competitor to the British Vickers 6-ton. The first prototype of the complex and expensive T-19 was finished in August 1931. Because both tanks had advantages and disadvantages, Ginsberg suggested developing a more powerful, hybrid tank with the hull, home-developed engine and armament from the native T-19, and the transmission and chassis from the British Vickers 6-ton. On January 26, 1931, Ikolepski wrote a letter to Ginsberg with information obtained via the intelligence service that the Polish government had decided to purchase Vickers 6-ton light infantry tanks as well as Christie M1931 cavalry tanks and to mass-produce them with the assistance of both the British and French. Because Poland was then considered, in Soviet military doctrine, to be the USSR's main enemy, the Soviet Revolutionary Military Council decided to pass the foreign tanks into Red Army service, starting their production immediately without waiting for completion of development works, in order to counter possible aggression. At that time, the RKKA had only several dozen outdated MKV, MKA and Renault Fort tanks, captured during the Russian Civil War, together with various armored cars and obsolescent domestic Ms-1 light infantry tanks. On February 13, 1931, the Vickers 6-ton light infantry tank, under the designator T26, officially entered service in the Red Army as the main tank for close support of combined arms units and tank units of High Command Reserve. One of the Vickers 6-ton tanks was tested for gunfire resistance in August 1931. The hull was subjected to rifle and Maxim machine gun fire with the use of normal and armor-piercing bullets at a range of 50 m. It was found that the armor withstood gunfire with minimal damage. Chemical analysis showed that the front armor plates were made from high-quality cemented armor, whereas the homogeneous roof and bottom armor plates were made from mediocre steel. Even so, the British armor was better than armor produced by its Ora factory for the first T-26s because of a shortage of modern metallurgical equipment in the USSR at that time. At the same time, the Faculty of Mechanization and Motorization of the Military Technical Academy named after F. E. Dzerzhinsky developed two tank models based on the Vickers 6-ton tank design but with an American Hercules 95 horsepower 6-cylinder water-cooled engine, improved front armor, and a driver's position on the left side. TMM stands for Tank Maloy Moshchnosti or Tank of Low Power. The TMM-1 was equipped with transmission details from the native YAR-5 truck and a ball mount for the DT tank machine gun in front of the hull, whereas the TMM-2 was equipped with an improved gearbox, a steering device without clutches and a 37mm Hotchkiss gun in the right turret. Representatives from the main Soviet tank manufacturers together with officials from the RKKA Mobilization Department considered the Hercules engine to be too difficult to produce, and the engine tended to overheat inside the engine compartment. Tests of TMM-1 and TMM-2 prototypes performed in the beginning of 1932 demonstrated no advantage over the Vickers 6-ton and the T-26. Design. The Soviets did not simply replicate the Vickers 6-ton. Like its British counterpart, the T26 Mod. 1931 had a twin-turreted configuration and was designed to carry two machine guns, mounting one in each turret. A major difference between the Soviet T26 Mod. 1931 and the British 6-ton were higher turrets on the T26, with an observation slit. Soviet turrets had a round firing port for the DT tank machine gun, as opposed to the rectangular ports used by the original British design for the Vickers machine gun. The front part of the hull was also slightly modified. Hulls of twin-turreted T-26s were assembled using armored plates riveted to a frame from metal angles. Some tanks, produced in 1931, had ceiling zinc shims at the hull bottom between armored plates for fording water obstacles. After problems with rain entering the engine compartment, a special cover was installed over an air outlet window after March 1932. Some T-26s produced at the end of 1932 or 1933 had a riveted and welded hull. The T-26 Mod. 1931 had two cylindrical turrets mounted on ball bearings. Each turret turned independently through 240 degrees. Both turrets could provide common fire in front and rear arcs of fire. The disadvantage of such configuration was that all the tank's firepower could not be used at once on the same side. 4 modifications of turrets existed, and they were mounted on tanks in different combinations. The hull and turrets of the T26 Mod. 1931 had a maximum armour thickness of 13 Euro 15 mm, which was sufficient to withstand light machine gun fire. Many twin-turreted tanks of the first series had 10 mm armour plates of low quality, which could be penetrated by 7.62 mm armour-piercing bullets from 150 m. In 1933, the Soviets unveiled the T26 Mod. 1933. The Model 1933, with a new single-cylindrical turret carrying one 45 mm cannon L-46 and one 7.62 mm machine gun, became the most common T-26 variant. The 45 mm 20K tank gun was based on the Soviet 45 mm anti-tank gun 19K, and it was one of the most powerful anti-tank gun of its time. Actually, few, if any, Western tanks existed with similar guns. The T-26 could carry up to 3 secondary DT 7.62 mm machine guns in coaxial, rear, and anti-aircraft mounts. This increased firepower was intended to aid crews in defeating dedicated anti-tank teams, as the original machine gun armament had been found insufficient. The turret rear ball mounting for the additional DT tank machine gun was installed on the T-26 tanks from the end of 1935 until 1939. The T-26 Model 1933 carried 122 rounds of 45 mm ammunition, firing armor-piercing 45 mm rounds with a muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second, or lower-velocity high-explosive munitions. Tanks intended for company commanders were equipped with a radio set and a handrail radio antenna on the turret. Later the handrail antenna was replaced with a buggy whip antenna, because experience in the Spanish Civil War and Battle of Lake Khasan showed that the handrail antenna drew fire onto commander tanks. The tank was powered by a T-26 90 horsepower flat-row 4-cylinder air-cooled petrol engine, which was a complete Soviet copy of the Armstrong-Siddeley engine used in the Vickers 6-ton. The engine was located in the rear part of the hull. Early Soviet-made tank engines were of bad quality, but they became better beginning in 1934. The T-26 engine did not have an overspeed limiter, which often resulted in overheating and engine valve breakage, especially in summer. A fuel tank for 182L and an oil box for 27L were placed alongside the engine. The engine required top-grade petrol. The use of second-rate petrol could cause damage to the valve units because of engine detonation. From mid-1932, a more capacious fuel tank and a simplified oil box were introduced. An engine cooling fan was mounted over the engine in a special shroud. From early 1932, the exhaust silencer was affixed by 3 clamps instead of 2. The transmission of the T-26 consisted of single-disc main dry clutch, a gearbox with 5 gears in the front part of the vehicle, steering clutches, final drives and band brakes. The gearbox was connected to the engine by a drive shaft passing through the vehicle. A gear change lever was mounted directly on the gearbox. The tank suspension consisted of 2 bogies, 4 rubber-covered return rollers, a track driving wheel and a track idler. Each bogie consisted of a cast box, 4 twin rubber-covered road wheels connected by balancing levers and 2 1/4 elliptic leaf springs. The cast track driving wheel with removable sprocket ring was located in front, and the track idler with a crank lever tightener was located in the rear part of the vehicle. A track made from chrome-nickel steel was 260 mm wide and consisted of 108 to Euro 109 links. The T-26 Mod. 1931 did not have a radio set. The tank commander communicated with the driver by speaking tube, which was replaced with a signaling lamp in 1932. The T-26 was equipped with 1 fire extinguisher, a kit of spare parts, tools and accessories, a canvas stowage, and a tow chain fixed on the rear of the hull. The T-26 could cross 0.75 m high vertical obstacles and 2.1 m wide trenches, ford 0.8 m deep water obstacles, cut 33 cm thick trees and climb 40° gradients. Needless to say, it was easy to drive. Beginning in 1937, There was an effort to equip many tanks with a second machine gun in the rear of the turret and an anti-aircraft machine gun on top of it, as well as the addition of 2 searchlights above the gun for night gunnery, a new VKU-3 command system, and a TPU-3 intercom. Some tanks had a vertically stabilized TOP-1 gun telescopic sight. Ammunition stowage for the main gun was improved from 122 rounds to 147. In 1938, the cylindrical turret was replaced with a conical turret, with the same 45mm Model 1934 gun. Some T26's Mod. 1938/1939, equipped with radio set, had a PTK commander's panoramic sight. In 1938, the T26 was upgraded to the Model 1938 version, which had a new conical turret with better anti-bullet resistance but the same welded hull as the T26 Mod. 1933 produced in 1935 a Euro 1936. This proved insufficient in the Battle of Lake Khasan in 1938, so the tank was upgraded once more in February 1939 to have an under-turret box with sloped 20mm side armoured plates. The turret featured an increase to 20mm at 18 degrees sloping. This time it was designated T26-1. There were subsequent attempts to thicken the front plate, but T26 production soon ended in favor of other designs, such as the T34. Series production. The beginning. In 1931, the only Soviet factory suitable for T26 production was the Bolshevik factory in Leningrad, which had had experience manufacturing the Ms-1 light tanks since 1927. It was also planned to use the Stalingrad tractor factory, which was under construction at that time. But the production of the T26 proved to be much more complicated than the semi-handicraft assembly of the Ms-1, so the planned production of 500 T26s in 1931 proved to be impossible. The Bolshevik factory needed to convert all tank drawings from imperial units into metric, in order to develop a production technology, special tools, and equipment. The first 10 T26s were assembled in July 1931. They were identical to British Vickers 6-ton tanks except for their armament. Soviet tanks were armed with a 37mm Hotchkiss gun in the right turret and the 7.62mm DT tank machine gun in the left turret. These T26s from the development batch were of low quality and made from mild steel, but it was an important test of the new tank production technology. The series production of the T26, equipped with new higher turrets with observation window, began in August 1931. Such turrets proved to be more suitable for mass production. The production of the T26 encountered many problems. A lot of armored hulls and turrets supplied by the Its-Ora factory were of low quality and were 10mm thick instead of the planned 13mm. Poor production standards were the reason behind the frequent failures of tank engines, gearboxes, springs in suspension, tracks and rubber-covered road wheels of early T26s. 35 of the 100 T26s produced by the Bolshevik factory in 1931 had hulls and turrets made from mild steel. Later, it was planned to replace these hulls with ones built of armor plate as well as to mount engines of better quality. The business plan for 1932 called for 3,000 T26s. For this, the tank workshop of the Bolshevik factory was reorganized into the factory number 174 named after K. E. Voroshilov in February 1932. The director of the tank factory became K. Sirkin and the chief engineer was S. Ginsberg. The problems with organizing the complicated new technological processes, poor production planning of parts suppliers, a great shortage of qualified engineers and technicians as well as of necessary equipment still resulted in many of the tanks being flawed, and they were not accepted by Army representatives. On October 26, 1932, the Trust of Special Machine Industry, consisting of 4 factories, was established to solve the problem of tank production in the USSR. The planned production of T26s for 1932 was decreased significantly and special attention was given to increasing the quality of the tanks. A production run of the new model single-turreted T26 armed with the 45mm gun was launched in mid-1933. The factory number 174 also manufactured a few T26s for military educational institutions. These were dissected tanks to demonstrate the relative position and function of tank components during training of tank crew. Production in Stalingrad equals. The Stalingrad tractor factory was considered as one of the factories for production of the T26 from 1932, but production in Stalingrad did not start until August 1933. This process went very slowly, with great difficulties because of delays with deliveries of machining equipment and press tools for the newly built factory. In 1936–1939 the design office of the STZ developed several experimental tanks based on the T26 tank and the STZ-5 transport tractor. For instance, the STZ-25 had the turret, rear part of the hull, engine and some transmission details from the T26 Mod. 1938, but the STZ-25 wheel-track tank weighed 11.7 tons and had 16 Euro 24 mm sloped armour. Factory managers tried to promote tanks of their own design rather than producing T26s. As a result, the STZ failed to organize the series production of the T26, but this experience helped to bring the T-34 into production in Stalingrad in 1941. The T-26s produced by STZ had no visual differences from other T-26s, but Stalingrad tanks were less reliable and more expensive. Modernization and repair Some early T-26 tanks were repaired in tank units or factories with the use of later production parts. This meant replacing the all-rubber road wheels and track idlers with new strengthened ones. Armour was added for the headlight. The armour thickness of the driver's hatch lower door of the twin-turreted tanks was increased from 6 to 10 mm and armoured PT-1 or PTK observation devices were installed. A common hatch above the engine, oil tank, and fuel tank was mounted starting in May 1940. In 1940, 255 T-26s were modernised in this way and in the first half of 1941 another 85 tanks were improved. A central factory responsible for the T-26's repair and modernization was the Factory of Carrying and Conveying Machines named after Skirov in Leningrad, and the Factory No. 105 named after El Kaganovich in Khabarovsk from the beginning of the Great Patriotic War until 1945. Production in 1941 The Factory No. 174 produced its last T-26 tanks in February 1941. After that, the factory began retooling to produce the new and much more complex T-50 light tank. This work was slowed by delays in the delivery of new equipment and series production of the T-50 did not begin on schedule. As a result, factory management decided to resume the production of the T-26, using T-26 hulls, turrets, and other parts already in stock. About 47 T-26 tanks were assembled and 77 were repaired in July–August 1941 before the factory was relocated from Leningrad to Chelyabinsk in the end of August 1941, and then to Kharkov in September 1941. The Factory No. 174 produced engines and spare parts for the T-26, installed additional armor plates on some T-26s, replaced flamethrowers with 45 mm tank guns in turrets of 130 kh T-133 flame-throwing tanks, repaired tanks in army units and mounted about 75 turrets from the T-26 and the T-50 as bunkers for the defense of Leningrad. Combat history. The T-26 entered active service for the Red Army in 1932. It was used in many conflicts of the 1930s as well as during World War II. The T-26 together with the BT was the main tank of the RKKA armoured forces during the interwar period. The T-26 light tank first saw action in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union provided Republican Spain with a total of 281 T-26 Mod. 1933 tanks starting in October 1936. T-26s were used in almost all military operations of the Spanish Civil War in 1936–1939 against nationalists and demonstrated superiority over the German Panzer I light tanks and Italian Ps-3 tankettes armed only with machine guns. During the Battle of Guadalajara, T-26s outclassed the Italian tankettes, inspiring the design of the first Italian medium tank, the Fiat M13/40. The next military operation the T-26 light tank participated in was the Soviet-Japanese border conflict. Commencing with the Battle of Lake Khasan, in July 1938. The 2nd Mechanized Brigade, the 32nd and the 40th Independent Tank Battalions had 257 T-26s, from which 76 tanks were damaged and 9 burnt towards the end of battle action. A small number of T-26 tanks and flame-throwing tanks based on the T-26 chassis participated in the Battle of Conical against Japanese forces in 1939. The T-26 was vulnerable to Japanese tank-killing teams armed with Molotov cocktails. Poor quality welds left gaps in the armor plate, and flaming petrol easily seeped into the fighting compartment and engine compartment. The 37mm gun on the Japanese Type 95 light tank, despite its mediocre performance, was also effective against the T-26. Portions of the armor plating on earlier models of the T-26 used riveted construction and were very vulnerable to both types of attacks. The use of riveted armor on some older T-26 models led to spalling, when the impact of enemy shells, even if they failed to disable the tank or kill the crew on their own, caused the rivets to break off and become projectiles inside the tank. On the eve of World War II, T-26s served mainly in separate light tank brigades and in separate tank battalions of rifle divisions. This was the type of tank units that participated in the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939 and in the Winter War of December 1939–March 1940. The Winter War proved that the T-26 was obsolete and its design reserve was totally depleted. Finnish 37mm anti-tank guns and even 20mm anti-tank rifles easily penetrated the T-26's thin anti-bullet armor, and tank units equipped with the T-26 suffered significant losses during the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line, in which the flame-throwing tanks based on the T-26 chassis played a significant role. By mid-1941, most of the Red Army's vast numbers of tanks were suffering from serious wear and tear. Poor quality roads, the vulnerabilities of track design in the early 1930s, and inadequate maintenance, recovery and repair services all took their toll. In some of the frontline armored units, up to half of the T-26, T-28 and BT tanks had major drivetrain components which were broken down or completely worn out, and these disabled tanks were parked and cannibalized for spare parts to keep the rest running. Tanks damaged during the 1939 Winter War with Finland were also cannibalized for parts. On June 1, 1941, the Red Army had 10,268 T-26 light tanks of all models on their inventories, including armored combat vehicles based on the T-26 chassis. T-26s composed a majority of the fighting vehicles in Soviet mechanized corps of the border military districts. For instance, the Western Special Military District had 1,136 T-26 tanks on June 22, 1941 could withstand most German tanks in 1941, but were inferior to the Panzer III and Panzer IV participating in Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and all of the Red Army's tank models suffered severe losses due to the complete air supremacy of the German Luftwaffe. The majority of the Red Army's T-26s were lost in the first months of the German-Soviet War, mainly to enemy artillery and airstrikes. Many tanks broke down for technical reasons and lack of spare parts. As the war progressed and Germany's lighter tanks were replaced by the Panzer III, Panzer IV and heavier tanks such as the Panther, the T-26 was gradually replaced through attrition by the vastly superior T-34. The remaining T-26s participated in battles with the Germans and their allies during the Battle of the Moscow in 1941–42, the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of the Caucasus in 1942–1943. Some tank units of the Leningrad Front used their T-26 tanks until 1944. The defeat of the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria in August 1945 was the last military operation in which Soviet T-26s were used. In the 1930s, T-26 light tanks were delivered to Spain, China and Turkey. They were used in the Second Sino-Japanese War by the Chinese in 1938–1944, especially in the Battle of Kunlun Pass. The Finnish army used captured T-26s of different models during the Continuation War, and some tanks served in Finland for various non-combat purposes until 1961. Captured T-26s were also used by the German, Romanian and Hungarian armies. Variants Twin-turreted tanks T26 Model 1931, twin-turreted version armed with 2 DT tank machine guns. The first series-produced variant of the T26 which was equipped with turrets differing from the initial Vickers design. Tanks produced from 1931 to March 1932 had a riveted hull and turrets, a silencer affixed with 2 clamps, and lacked any cover over the air outlet window. About 1,177 T26 Mod. 1931 tanks armed with machine guns were accepted by the Red Army, which had 1,015 such twin-turreted tanks on April 1, 1933. T26 Model 1931 with gun plus machine gun armament, twin-turreted version with a 37mm gun in the right turret. There were 2 models of 37mm guns in the USSR suitable for mounting in light tanks at the Tamir the Hotchkiss gun, and the more powerful Ps2 gun developed by P3 The latter was superior, but only experimental models existed. Therefore, the first 10 pre-production T26s, which had a design identical to the Vickers 6-ton, were equipped with a Hotchkiss gun in the right turret to increase firepower compared to the machine gun-armed Vickers tank. The experimental Ps2 gun was mounted on only 3 T26 tanks, the right turrets of which were replaced with small gun turrets from the T35-1. As the series production of the Ps2 gun was delayed, the main artillery agency of the RKKA gave preference to a new gun. It was developed by the Artillery Design Office of the Bolshevik Factory, constructed from parts taken from the previously purchased German 37mm anti-tank gun developed by Rheinmetall and the Ps2 gun. This system was successfully tested and the Artillery Factory No. 8 named after M. Kalinin started its series production under the designator B3. The B3 gun had less recoil and a smaller breech compared to the Ps2, so it could be easily mounted in the normal machine gun turret of the T26. The first twin-turreted T26 was armed with a B3 gun in the right turret in late 1931. Unfortunately, series production of the B3 gun proceeded slowly due to poor production standards. Completed B3 guns were mounted on BT-2 light tanks after mid-1932. This meant the twin-turreted T26 tanks continued to be equipped with old 37mm Hotchkiss guns. As production of the PS1 gun had ended, some guns were taken from military supply depots and scrapped Ms-1, T-18, tanks. The initial plan was to arm every 5th T-26 with a 37mm gun in the right turret, but the final proportion was somewhat higher. About 450 twin-turreted T26 Mod. 1931 tanks mounting the 37mm gun in the right turret were produced in 1931–1933. There were 392 T26 Mod. 1931 tanks with gun plus machine gun armament in the Red Army on April 1, 1933. T26, twin-turreted version with a 76.2mm recoilless gun in the right turret. At the end of 1933 M. Tukachevsky suggested equipping some T26 Mod. 1931 tanks with the 76.2mm BPK recoilless gun designed by A.L.V. Kerchevsky in a right turret to increase firepower. One prototype tank was built in 1934. BPK had a muzzle velocity of 500 meters per second and a range of 4 kilometers. The tank was able to carry 62 4-kilogram rounds. The test performed on March 9, 1934 demonstrated a significant increase in firepower, but the recoilless gun proved difficult to reload on the move, and the powerful blast projected behind the weapon when fired was dangerous to infantrymen behind the tank. Shortcomings were also observed in the design of the gun itself, and so the planned rearmament of twin-turreted T26 tanks with recoilless guns did not take place. T26 TU, twin-turreted version with a simplex radio station number 7N and a handrail frame antenna on the hull. The antenna lead was located in the front part of the under-turret box roof between the turrets. The vehicle was intended for platoon commanders. 3 such tanks were successfully tested in September 1932 and 7 more radio stations were delivered to the factory number 174, but it is unknown whether they were ever mounted on twin-turreted T26 tanks. Series production of twin-turreted command radio tanks was scheduled to begin on January 1, 1933, but this did not occur because radio stations number 7N were in short supply and because of the introduction of single-turreted T26s with series-produced 71 TK1 radio stations. One twin-turreted T26 was given to the Research Institute of Communication in March 1932 to develop special tank communication devices. The plan was to equip each tank with a keyphone, while a platoon commander's tank would be equipped with a telephone switch for 6 subscribers. A special terminal block was mounted on the rear of the tank so that communication wires could be connected. The work remained experimental. Single-turreted tanks equals T26 Model 1933, single-turret version armed with 45mm 20K tank gun and DT tank machine gun. This version had a new cylindrical turret with a large rear niche. Some tanks were equipped with a 71 TK1 radio station with a handrail antenna around the turret. They were upgraded in 1935 with a welded hull and turret, and again in 1936 with a rear DT tank machine gun in the turret. In 1937, some tanks were equipped with an anti-aircraft machine gun and a searchlight. The Model 1933 was the most numerous variant. T26 Model 1938, new conical turret, small changes in hull parts, increased volume of fuel tanks. Tank Gun Mod 1937 and Mod 1938 were equipped with an electric breech block and a vertically stabilized TOP-1 telescopic sight. T26 Model 1939, under-turret box with sloped armored plates, rear machine gun removed on some tanks, 97 horsepower engine. Tanks built after 1940 were equipped with an under-turret box made from 20mm homogeneous armor, a unified observation device, and a new turret ring. Some tanks were equipped with armored screens. About 1,975 T26 tanks with a conical turret were produced. T26 screened, tank with additional armor plating. Some modern sources mention this tank as T26E. The factory number 174 developed the design of 30 Euro 40mm applique copyright armor for all types of single-turreted T26s during the Winter War. On December 30, 1939, factory tests proved that the T26 with applique copyright armor successfully resisted fire from a 45mm anti-tank gun at a range from 400 to Euro 500 m. Side and front armored plates were mounted with the use of blunt bolts and electric welding. Toward the middle of February 1940, the RKKA received 27 screen T26 Mod 1939 tanks and 27 KHT-133 flame-throwing tanks. An additional 15 T26 Mod 1939 tanks were armored by workshops of the 8th Army and Shore in the beginning of March 1940. All in all, 69 T26s with applique copyright armor were used during the Winter War and 20 more were delivered to tank units after the end of the war. Combat use proved that Finnish light anti-tank guns could not penetrate the armor of these tanks. The T26 Mod 1939 with applique copyright armor weighed 12 tons, which caused an overload of the chassis, transmission, and engine of the light tank. Drivers were advised to use low gears only. During the Great Patriotic War, a mounting of 15 Euro 40mm applique copyright armor on about 100 different T26s was performed by local factories in Leningrad in 1941 Euro 1942, during the Siege of Odessa, the Battle for Moscow and the Siege of Sevastopol. A cutting of armored plates was more rough than developed during the Winter War. The majority of these modified tanks did not have a moving armored gun mask as seen in factory number 174's original design, and some tanks had front-applique copyright armor only. Artillery tanks. T26 with the A43 turret, artillery T26 or tank of fire support with a turret developed by self-taught inventor N. Dyrenkov at the Experimental Design Office of the Department of Mechanization and Motorization of the RKKA. Two types of turrets, armed with a 76mm regimental gun mod. 1927 and DT tank machine gun in a ball mount, were assembled by the Itzora factory. They were partially pressed and welded. The first variety was installed on the T26 Mod. 1931 in February 1932 and the second type was used in November 1932. It was found that the A43 turret was very tight for 2 crew members. It had insufficient observation field. There was not any turret ventilation which made continuous gunfire difficult. And it was hard to rotate the turret manually. At the beginning of 1933, a new 76mm KT Tank Gun Mod. 1927/32 with reduced recoil length was installed into the A43 turret. The turret was still a very tight place for crew members. The ammunition stowage for 54 rounds was unsuccessful, and the military refused the A43 turret. T26-4, artillery tank with enlarged turret armed with a 76.2mm KT Tank Gun Mod. 1927/32. The turret was developed by the Bolshevik factory in 1931–1932. It was installed on the T26 Mod. 1931 in November 1932. Unlike the A43 turret, the turret by factory number 174 was much more convenient for the crew. The turret of the T26-4 was quite similar to main turret of the T28 medium tank. The T26-4 with the KT tank gun passed tests successfully and 5 vehicles were built in 1933–1934 as pilot batch. Initially it was planned to arm 3 of these T26-4 with the 76.2mm KT tank gun mod. 1927/32 and the other 2 tanks with the 76.2mm Ps3 Tank Gun. The Ps3 Tank Gun was developed at the Experimental Engineering Mechanical Department of the factory number 174 by engineer P3 The Ps3 had better specifications in comparison with the series-produced KT Tank Gun and also had several technical innovations. The T26-4 armed with the Ps3 Tank Gun was tested in October 1933 but it was found that the Ps3 was too powerful for the T26 light tanker turret's race ring and hull roof were deformed during gunfire, and the suspension springs were damaged. It was decided to arm the T26-4 with the 76.2mm KT Tank Gun only. All 5 experimental T26-4 artillery tanks were tested during military exercises near Leningrad in September 1934 before scheduled series production of 50 such vehicles in 1935. But on September 19, 1934 an incident with a T26-4 took place, a blowback because of shell case destruction during gunfire. Despite the fact that this defect was unrelated to turret design, the military representatives cancelled the order to produce the T26-4. Also the work to design turretless AT-1 artillery tanks armed with a powerful 76.2mm Ps3 tank gun started at that time. The T26-4's turret construction was the design used in the series-produced BT-7A artillery tank. In 1939, the Armoured Directorate of the Red Army ordered the development of a new conical turret for the T26 similar to the BT-7's turret and to arm it with a 76.2mm L-10 tank gun. Engineers of the factory number 174 felt it was impossible to implement this project because it would lead to a significant overload of T26's chassis. Armoured combat vehicles A large variety of different armoured combat vehicles were developed on the T26 chassis in the 1930s. Among them were KH T26, KHT-130 and KHT-133 flame-throwing tanks. T-26T artillery tractors. T-26 and Tu-26 remotely controlled tanks. Street 26 bridge-laying tanks. Su-5 self-propelled guns. Experimental armored cargo personnel carriers, reconnaissance vehicles, and many others. The majority of these vehicles were developed at the Leningrad factory of experimental mechanical engineering by talented Soviet engineers P.N. Syashentov, S.A. Ginsberg, L.S. Troyanov, N. Vitsits, B.A. Andreevich, M.P. Zigel and others. Various vehicle-mounted equipment was developed for the T-26, including mine-clearing attachments, inflatable pontoons and a snorkel system for fording water obstacles, devices for overcoming obstacles and many others. T-26 light tanks were also modified into different armored combat vehicles in the field during wartime. Foreign variants 7.5 nm Pak 97/38, F, off PZ 740, R, 10 Pak 97-38 anti-tank guns with shields were experimentally mounted on captured Soviet T-26 light tank chassis, resulting in vehicles designated 7.5 nm Pak 97/38, F, off PZ 740, R. These self-propelled guns served with the 3rd Company of the 563rd Anti-Tank Battalion before being replaced by Marder 3 on March 1, 1944. T-26K, Finnish variant used for driver training. Similar to the T-26T artillery tractor, but with more boxy superstructure. 5 built from captured T-26s from 1947 to 1952. T-26V, Finnish variant proposed for towing anti-tank guns. Similar to the T-26T artillery tractor. 3 prototypes converted from captured T-26s in 1944. Survivors, there are about 45 T-26 tanks of various models preserved in different museums and military schools. The most notable of them are, twin-turreted T26 Mod. 1931 in the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. This tank from the 115th Rifle Division with shell holes was raised from a river bottom on the site of river crossing at Nevsky Pietrachok in July 1989 by Katrin Diving Club. The vehicle was restored at the Par-Currency RNU Training Tank Regiment of the Leningrad Military District. It was donated to the museum in February 1998. Only 2 such vehicles are preserved at the present time. Twin-turreted T26 Mod. 1931 with gun plus machine gun armament and riveted hull in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Moscow Oblast. The single surviving twin-turreted T26 armed with a 37mm gun. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. This late production variant was transferred from Kubinka Tank Museum in the 1980s. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Museum Diorama breaching of the blockade of the Leningrad in Markino village near Kirovsk, Leningrad Oblast. This tank with a large shell hole on the right side of the hull and without turret was raised from a river bottom at Nevsky Pietrachok in May 2003. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Museum of the Northwestern Front in Staraya Russa, Novgorod Oblast. This tank was raised from the Lovat River in 1981 and became a monument to Soviet tankers in Kirovichino village. The vehicle was given to the museum in May 2004. The tank has inauthentic tracks. T26 Mod. 1933 in the El Galozo Barracks Museum in Madrid. The tank with nationalist Spanish markings with pressed gun mask is armed with a Hotchkiss machine gun instead of a DT tank machine gun. Produced in 1936. The anti-aircraft machine gun and the handrail radio antenna are late dummies. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Parola Tank Museum, Finnish tactical number PS163 Euro33, in drivable condition. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Parola Tank Museum. This tank is described in many sources as early version of the T26 Mod. 1933. but in reality this is the Finnish wartime modernization of a hull from T26 flame-throwing tank with a mounted riveted turret with a small rear niche from the early BT-5 light tank. T26 Mod. 1933 in the Parola Tank Museum, the Finnish wartime modernization of a hull from T26 flame-throwing tank with a mounted turret from the BT-7 light tank. T26 Mod. 1933 in front of the Istanbul Military Museum. One of the 64 T26 tanks that were purchased from Russia in 1934. The T26 remained in service with the Turkish Army until 1943. T26 Mod. 1939 in the Kubinka Tank Museum, Moscow Oblast, this tank with pressed turret front armored plate is in drivable condition. The tank has combat damage taken during the Great Patriotic War. T26 Mod. 1939 in the Parola Tank Museum, the Finnish wartime modernization. A hull from a KHT-133 flame-throwing tank with a mounted turret from the T26 Mod. 1938/1939 and a bore mount for the DT tank machine gun in a hull front armored plate. KHT-130 flame-throwing tank in the Kubinka Tank Museum, Moscow Oblast. In reality this is the Tu-26 teletank control vehicle with a dummy flamethrower. KHT-130 flame-throwing tank in the military unit number 5776 in Brezhnev, Kita Oblast, monument with an incomplete chassis. Before 1990 the vehicle stood in the territory of one of military units of the Soviet 39th Army of the Transbaikal Military District. The single preserved KHT-130 at the present time. See also, Combat History of the T-26. Notes. References. Published sources External links, T-26, Development History and Combat Employment. Short info about the T-26, T-26 Mod. 1931, photos of twin-turreted T-26, T-26 Mod. 1933, photos of T-26 Mod. 1933, T-26 Mod. 1938/39, photos of T-26 Mod. 1938 and Mod. 1939, T-26 with additional armour, photos of T-26 with applica copyright armour, light tank T-26, combat use of the T-26, many photos of T-26, foreign tanks in Finnish service, Axis History Factbook, Axis History, Russia's T-26 light tanks, www.wivehicles.com, Ferris, Dave. Russian-Soviet Section I Russian-Soviet Section I, in the Book of Tanks, a wargamer's portable guide to tanks, self-propelled guns, armored cars, and personnel carriers from World War I through the 1990s, self-published, URL access November 10, 2006, T-26 tanks, T-26 tanks in museums and monuments. Video Tank T-26, T-26 Mod. 1939 in drivable condition from the Kubinka Tank Museum, Russia, Tank T-26, T-26 Mod. 1939 in drivable condition from the Kubinka Tank Museum, Tank T-26, replica of T-26 Mod. 1933, Tank T-26, T-26 Mod. 1939 in drivable condition from the Parola Tank Museum, Tank T-26, T-26 Mod. 1939 in drivable condition from the Parola Tank Museum.